Of the 58 Super Bowls played, there have been some all-time classics that everyone remembers. But there have also been some pretty underwhelming championship games that obviously aren't talked about as much. Well, these are the games that I'll be getting into today. I've compiled a list of what, in my opinion, are the worst Super Bowls ever played. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and don't worry, I'll also be doing my list for the best Super Bowls in another video, so make sure you come back to check that out. But for now, get set, because today I'll be discussing the 15 worst Super Bowls ever played. I'll be doing this list in reverse order, meaning the number one worst Super Bowl will be mentioned last, so be sure to watch the full video. Starting off the list at number 15, and this may be controversial, but I have Super Bowl I. I have to admit that it feels wrong adding this one to the list, considering it's the game that kicked off the largest sporting event in the country. But while Super Bowl I is remembered in reverence to the greatness of legendary coach and the Super Bowl trophy's namesake, Vince Lombardi, it isn't necessarily remembered as a great game. In Super Bowl I, the Green Bay Packers represented the National Football League in the first ever Super Bowl matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs of the American Football League. But this historic game wasn't much of a game at all, with the Packers walking away victorious with a winning margin of 25 points, the final score being 35-10. The game was pretty close heading into halftime, being only 14-10 in favor of the Packers, but the Chiefs went scoreless in the second half as Green Bay racked up 21 unanswered points. Obviously, this is a legendary game, but in terms of the game itself, it was all but wrapped up by the fourth quarter, and many fans referring to the second half as a snooze fest. Honestly, if not for this being the first ever Super Bowl, I may have even ranked it higher on this list. Coming in at number 14 is Super Bowl 55. Patrick Mahomes is resembling Tom Brady in terms of postseason dominance as he continues to rack up Super Bowl rings and looks to add another to his arsenal this year. But when Mahomes and the Chiefs faced off against Brady and the Buccaneers in Super Bowl 55, Brady asserted his dominance. Tampa Bay's defense kept Mahomes and the high-powered Chiefs offense in check all game, only allowing 9 points as the Bucs went on to score 31. In a matchup between two great quarterbacks, Brady made sure his claim as the GOAT went unquestioned. Tampa Bay held control over the game from start to finish, and what appeared to be an all-time great Super Bowl matchup turned into a rather boring affair. At number 13, I have Super Bowl VI, which featured a game between the Dallas Cowboys and Miami Dolphins, and it was actually the coldest Super Bowl ever played with a kickoff temperature of 39 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold weather may have slowed down the Dolphins, but not the Cowboys, and Dallas went on to dominate the championship game. The Cowboys set then Super Bowl records for most team rushing yards with 252, most first downs with 23, and fewest points allowed, only allowing Miami to score one field goal all game. However, the Cowboys' offense wasn't really overly exciting either, scoring only once per quarter, and the final score of 24-3 was low enough not to be exciting, but still a big enough margin to be considered a blowout. In other words, it was pretty uneventful, especially for the Super Bowl. At number 12 is Super Bowl XX. This was one of the most boring and most one-sided Super Bowls ever played in a game between the Chicago Bears and New England Patriots. The infamous 85 Bears defense capped off their historic season by holding the Patriots to just 10 points as they went on to rack up 46, winning by a margin of 36 points. Not only was this a boring game to watch as the Bears dominated every facet of the game, but we didn't even get to see legendary Bears running back Walter Payton score a touchdown on the biggest stage as the Patriots defense targeted him all game, and Bears coach Mike Ditka opted instead to let defensive lineman William the Fridge Perry punch in a goal line score even though the game was already out of reach. Ditka has said that not giving Peyton the chance to score in the game is the biggest regret of his career, and most fans feel the same way. All in all, there was little to no excitement in this game, and it was essentially over by halftime. The final score was 46-10, but honestly, it felt like even more of a blowout. At number 11 is Super Bowl XXXVII, which had one of the best storylines coming into the game with first-year Buccaneers coach John Gruden squaring off against his former team, the Oakland Raiders, who unexpectedly traded him to the Bucs ahead of the 2002 season, despite leading the Raiders to the AFC Championship game the year before. Not only this, but it was also the first Super Bowl that had the league's number one ranked offense, the Raiders, face off against the league's top defense, the Bucs. In this matchup, it's safe to say that Gruden got his revenge. There's a few conspiracies that hang around this game, but in a nutshell, the Raiders may have fired Gruden, but they continued to use his playbook, which led to the Buccaneers knowing just about every play they were going to run. And as a result, Raiders quarterback Rich Gannon threw for a Super Bowl record 5 interceptions, 3 of which were returned for touchdowns. The Bucs defense also sacked Gannon 5 times on their way to scoring 34 consecutive points. And by the end of the third quarter, the game was all but over. The Raiders fired back in the final quarter, but it was far too late, and the game ended with the Bucs winning 48-21, and it was never even close. This game also featured one of the biggest Super Bowl MVP snubs in league history, as Tampa Bay safety Dexter Jackson was named the game's MVP after having 2 key interceptions. But fellow defensive back Dwight Smith also had 2 picks of his own, and he returned each of his for touchdowns. Smith also recorded more tackles than Jackson. And if you want to hear more about this and other Super Bowl MVP snubs, keep an eye out for a video that'll be dropping soon that discusses the biggest Super Bowl MVP snubs ever. At number 10, I have Super Bowl 18, which was a clash between the Oakland Raiders and Washington Redskins, who both had some firepower on their offensive units. However, only the Raiders were able to get things going, as the Redskins defense just couldn't stop running back Marcus Allen, who posted a crazy stat line of 191 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 catches for 18 yards. On the other side of the ball, Redskins running back and Hall of Famer John Riggins had an okay day with 65 yards rushing and a touchdown, but Washington QB Joe Theismann struggled heavily. By the end of the first half, Theismann threw 1 pick six and lost a fumble near his own goal line that resulted in another Raiders score. With a final score of 38-9, the Redskins were no match for the high-powered Raiders, and it led to an underwhelming game. At number 9 is Super Bowl 5, which is highly regarded as the sloppiest Super Bowl ever played. This showdown between the Dallas Cowboys and Baltimore Colts saw 11 total turnovers coming from 6 interceptions and 7 total fumbles, although only 5 were recovered. There was a fumbled punt return, a fumbled kick return, and there was even a blocked extra point. To go along with this, there were 14 penalties throughout the game that racked up to 166 penalty yards, though 133 of those yards came from the Cowboys. The final score of 16-13 may make you believe that this was an all-time classic, but when you actually watch the game, you'd think you were watching a junior varsity scrimmage due to all the errors that you wouldn't expect from what should be the 2 best teams in the league. The Colts ended up winning on a last-minute field goal, but by the end of the game, fans were almost happy to see this catastrophe of a Super Bowl come to an end. And to prove how sloppy this game was, the player named MVP was Cowboys linebacker Chuck Howley. And this isn't strange only because he's a defensive player, but because he played for the losing team. Howley did have a great game, but this just goes to show how poorly both teams played. Coming in at number 8 is Super Bowl 12, which was a matchup between the Cowboys and Denver Broncos. There was a good storyline coming into this game, as the Broncos quarterback, Craig Morton, was the former backup QB on the Cowboys, so he was squaring off against his former team. And not only this, but Morton led the Broncos to their first ever postseason appearance in franchise history and ended up making it all the way to the big game. However, he had possibly the worst game of his career. Dallas ended up beating Denver by 17 points with a final score of 27-10, but the score isn't the entire problem here. As Morton struggled, he was pulled from the game in favor of backup Norris Weiss. Together, Morton and Weiss threw for a combined 61 total yards and 4 interceptions, with all 4 picks coming from Morton. The longest play of the game for Denver was just 21 yards, and the dominant play from the Cowboys defense led to the first and only time co-Super Bowl MVPs were named, with defensive linemen Randy White and Harvey Martin being given the honors. At number 7 is Super Bowl 22, which was an absolute blowout as the Washington Redskins trounced the John Elway-led Broncos by a score of 42-10. The game actually started out in Denver's favor, with the Broncos going up 10-0 by the end of the first quarter, but they then went on to go scoreless for the remainder of the game. The Redskins answered by scoring 35 unanswered points in just the second quarter alone and never looked back. Washington quarterback Doug Williams led the charge by tossing 4 touchdowns with 340 yards, and alongside Williams was third-string running back Timmy Smith, who, despite being brought up as a last-minute starter, scored 2 touchdowns of his own and even set a Super Bowl record for rushing yards with 204. What started out as a promising championship game turned into one of the most decisive wins in Super Bowl history. At number 6 is Super Bowl 35, which featured one of the most dominant defenses in NFL history, with Ray Lewis leading the Baltimore Ravens against the New York Giants. The Ravens' D lived up to the hype, and they didn't allow the Giants to score a single offensive point. They forced 5 turnovers, including an interception returned for a touchdown by defensive back Dwayne Starks. In fact, the Ravens either forced a punt or a turnover on every single one of the Giants' offensive possessions, except for their final drive, and that's only because they still had the ball when time expired. The Ravens ultimately walked away with a 34-7 win, and the Giants' only score in this game came off a 97-yard kickoff return by Ron Dixon, but this excitement was short-lived as the Ravens answered with a kickoff return TD of their own immediately after. The game never even felt close, which is why it's on this list. At the number 5 spot is Super Bowl 27, which was another lopsided affair between the Dallas Cowboys and Buffalo Bills, with a lousy final score of 52-17 in favor of the Cowboys. Dallas was well in control heading into the second half, and they took any hope the Bills had of a comeback away after going on a 21-0 run in the fourth quarter. Buffalo just didn't show up for this game, allowing 35 points off of a whopping 8 turnovers, and the game was all but over by the midway point in the third quarter, which is what landed it on this list. At number 4 is Super Bowl 29. In this matchup, Steve Young and the 49ers took on Junior Seau and the San Diego Chargers. Young came into the game hoping he could get the monkey off his back and prove that he could win the big game following the recent departure of Niners legendary QB Joe Montana, and he did just that. This game wasn't a total blowout, but it was obvious from the start that San Francisco was in control. They were winning by 30 points and already giving head coach George Seifert a Gatorade shower as the Chargers scored their final touchdown of the game to bring the final score of 49-26. This game did have some great highlights and a good storyline for Steve Young, but with the 49ers' dominant performance, there was never any question of who was going to win the game. At number 3 is Super Bowl 48, a matchup between the Seattle Seahawks and Denver Broncos. This game had so much potential, with the league MVP Peyton Manning leading the Denver Broncos against the Seahawks' legendary Legion of Boom defense. But all the hype around this game faded fast after the Broncos had a high snap go out of the back of the end zone for a safety on the very first play of the game. Seattle went on to make 2 field goals in the first quarter, followed by a rushing touchdown from Marshawn Lynch and a 69-yard pick six by Malcolm Smith, who went on to be named the game's MVP. All in all, Denver was only able to find the end zone once, scoring on the final play of the third quarter, and when it was all said and done, the Seahawks walked away with a dominant 43-8 victory in one of the least entertaining Super Bowls ever. At the number 2 spot is Super Bowl 53, which was a showdown between the New England Patriots and the Los Angeles Rams. Now, this wasn't necessarily the worst game, but as far as Super Bowls go, saying this game was a letdown is honestly an understatement. The Patriots came away with the victory, beating the Rams by 10 points with an exciting final score of 13-3. It was a defensive battle to say the least, and not only was this the lowest scoring Super Bowl in history, but it was also the first title game that didn't have even one touchdown scored by either team through the first 3 quarters. Not just this, but the first points of the game weren't even scored until 5 minutes into the second quarter when the Patriots took a 3-0 lead with a field goal. The Rams tied it up with a field goal of their own in the third, which turned out to be the only score of the quarter, meaning the game was tied 3-3 heading into the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl. Running back Sony Michel punched in the only touchdown of the game with a 2-yard run midway through the fourth to put New England ahead, and then a late Patriots field goal ended up sealing the victory. You could argue that this was a fun game to watch considering how close it was until the very end, but at the end of the day, it may have been the least exciting Super Bowl ever played. And finally, at the number 1 spot, the game that's far and away the worst Super Bowl ever played, in my opinion, is Super Bowl 24, which featured a matchup between the San Francisco 49ers and the Denver Broncos. This game had so much potential, with 2 Hall of Fame quarterbacks squaring off, with Joe Montana leading the 49ers and John Elway leading the Broncos, but San Fran dominated this game from start to finish, going up 27-3 by halftime. The Niners continued the beatdown in the second half, scoring 28 more points and allowing only 1 Broncos touchdown, leading to a final score of 55-10. This game also set a few Super Bowl records, like largest point differential with a ridiculous 45 points, most points scored by one team with 55, and most touchdowns scored by one team with 8, making this the most lopsided championship game ever played, and landing this game at the number 1 spot on my list of the worst Super Bowls ever played. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and let me know your thoughts on my list and rankings below. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel so you know when I make my next upload, but until next time, get set because I'll have another video coming soon.